Grandpa, you need to step away from the vehicle lane. You're holding up traffic.
A 76-year-old man stood at the gate of Fort Bragg with nothing but a faded military ID and a paper bag full of old photographs. The MP on duty took one look at him and said, "Sir, this credential expired 11 years ago. I can't let you through." The old man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there in his worn denim jacket, staring past the gate toward the buildings he once called home. The second MP walked over, crossed his arms and said, "Sir, you need to step away from the vehicle lane. You're holding up traffic." And the old man, Harold Pickett, a man who had once pulled 13 wounded soldiers out of a burning compound in Fallujah, under direct enemy fire, quietly stepped to the side and waited. He had been waiting his whole life. He could wait a little longer. If you believe that every veteran deserves to be treated with dignity no matter how old they are or what they look like, comment the word respect right now before we continue. Harold Pickett was not the kind of man who told stories about himself. He lived alone in a small 2-bedroom house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, about 12 minutes from the main gate of Fort Bragg. The house had belonged to his wife, Linda, who passed away 3 years earlier after a long fight with pancreatic cancer. After she died, Harold stopped going out much. He stopped attending the VFW meetings on Thursday nights. He stopped answering calls from the few friends he still had. He spent most of his days sitting on the back porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the birds fight over the feeder Linda had hung from the dogwood tree the spring before she got sick. His neighbours knew him as the quiet man who mowed his lawn every Saturday morning at exactly 7:15, and who always had his trash cans back in the garage by noon on collection day. They did not know that Harold had served 31 years in the United States Army. They did not know that he had deployed to 4 combat zones across 3 decades. They did not know that the tattoo on the left side of his neck, partially hidden by the collar of whatever shirt he happened to be wearing, was the insignia of one of the most elite and secretive units in the history of American special operations. Harold never mentioned any of it. Not to his neighbours, not to the kid who bagged his groceries at the commissary, before it became off-limits to him, not even to Linda during the last months of her life when she begged him to talk about something, anything, other than her medication schedule. The past, Harold believed, belonged to the men who didn't come home. Talking about it felt like stealing from the dead. The morning Harold drove to Fort Bragg started like any other. He woke at 5:30, made coffee, fed the stray cat that had taken up residence under his porch, and sat down at the kitchen table with a shoebox he hadn't opened in over a decade. Inside were photographs. Not the digital kind that lived on phones and clouds. Real photographs. Printed on paper that had yellowed at the edges. Photographs of young men in desert camouflage with dust on their faces and rifles slung across their chests. Photographs of helicopters sitting on landing pads in places whose names Harold could still pronounce but chose not to. Photographs of a young Harold Pickett, lean and sunburned and utterly unrecognizable compared to the man who now sat at the kitchen table with arthritic hands and a hearing aid. He forgot to charge half the time. In one photograph, Harold stood with his arm around another soldier, both of them grinning like idiots despite the fact that they had just spent 48 hours in a firefight that killed 2 members of their team. The other soldier's name was David Moreno. He was the reason Harold decided to go to the base that morning. 3 days earlier, Harold had received a letter, not an email, not a text, a physical letter, handwritten on plain white paper and mailed in a standard envelope with no return address. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Moreno. She was David's daughter. She explained that she was organising a memorial for her father, who had passed away 6 months earlier from complications related to injuries sustained during his service. She wanted to include photographs and personal remembrances from the men who served with him. She had tracked Harold down through a veterans network and was asking if he had anything he could share. She mentioned that the memorial event was being held on base at the Special Operations Memorial Chapel, and she included the date and time. That date was today. Harold looked at the photographs in the shoebox. He looked at the young face of David Moreno, frozen in time, grinning in the desert sun. And for the first time in 3 years, Harold Pickett got dressed with a purpose. He put on clean jeans, a pressed button-down shirt, his denim jacket and his old boots. He placed the photographs carefully in a paper bag, tucked the letter into his breast pocket, and drove to Fort Bragg. The main gate of Fort Bragg was not the same gate Harold remembered. Everything had changed. The security infrastructure had been upgraded multiple times since Harold's retirement. New barriers, new scanners, new protocols. Harold pulled his truck up to the checkpoint and rolled down his window. The MP who approached was young, maybe 23 or 24, with a crisp uniform and a face that had never seen a combat zone. Harold handed over his old military ID card. The MP looked at it, looked at Harold, looked back at the card and frowned. The card had expired in 2013. It still listed Harold's rank as Command Sergeant Major, but the photo on the card showed a man who looked nothing like the weathered, white-haired figure sitting behind the wheel of a 15-year-old Ford pickup. The MP handed the card back and said, "Sir, this ID is expired. I can't grant you access with this." Harold nodded slowly. He explained that he was trying to attend a memorial service at the Special Operations Chapel. He mentioned the name David Moreno. He mentioned the letter from Catherine Moreno. The MP listened politely but shook his head. "Sir, I understand, but without valid credentials or a sponsor on the access list, I can't let you through. That's the policy." Harold asked if there was someone he could call. The MP said Harold could contact the event organizer and have them add his name to the visitor list through the proper channels. Harold didn't have Catherine Moreno's phone number. The letter hadn't included one. He sat in his truck for a moment, unsure of what to do. Cars were lining up behind him. The MP gestured for him to pull to the side. Harold pulled his truck into the visitor holding area beside the gate and got out. He walked over to the pedestrian entrance where a second MP was stationed. This one was older, maybe 30, a staff sergeant with a deployment patch on his right shoulder. Harold approached him and explained the situation again. He showed the expired ED, he showed the letter. The staff sergeant read the letter, glanced at the ID, and then looked at Harold with an expression that was not unkind, but was also not particularly moved. "Sir, I appreciate your service, but I can't override gate protocol based on a letter and an expired ED. If you were on the access list, you'd be in the system. You're not in the system." Harold nodded again. He asked if there was a phone he could use to contact someone on base. The staff sergeant pointed to a small office building adjacent to the gate and said Harold could try the visitor centre, but he doubted anyone there would be able to help without advance coordination. Harold thanked him and walked toward the building. His knees ached. His left hip, the one that had been reconstructed after a training accident in 1994, sent a sharp bolt of pain up his spine with every step. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man who had learned that the ground could betray you at any moment. A young specialist standing near the barrier watched him go and muttered something to the MP at the gate. Harold didn't hear what was said, but the specialist smirked, and the MP shook his head with a half-smile. To them, Harold was just another confused retiree who didn't understand that the world had moved on. They saw men like him every week, old guys with expired cards and fading memories who showed up at the gate expecting the past to still mean something. It was sad, sure, but it wasn't their problem. Inside the visitor centre, Harold found a small waiting room with plastic chairs, a water cooler, and a television mounted on the wall playing the Armed Forces network. The room smelled like floor cleaner and stale coffee. A small artificial plant sat in the corner, its fake leaves coated with a thin layer of dust. 2 other people were waiting. A young woman with a toddler on her lap trying to get a dependent ED renewed. An older man in a VFW cap filling out paperwork for a cemetery visit. Neither of them looked up when Harold walked in. A civilian employee sat behind a plexiglass window. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a lanyard with more keycards than anyone should need. Harold approached and explained his situation for the 3rd time. The civilian was sympathetic but unhelpful. She told Harold that without a valid ID, a sponsor, or advance registration through the Defense Biometric Identification System, there was no mechanism to grant him access. She suggested he contact the event coordinator and try again another day. Harold explained that the memorial was today, that it was happening in a few hours, that he had photographs in his bag that belonged to the family of a dead soldier. The civilian offered to make a phone call to the chapel, but after being transferred twice and placed on hold for 10 minutes, she was told that the event coordinator was not available and that no one had authorization to add walk-in visitors to the access list on the day of the event. Harold thanked her and walked back outside. He stood in the parking lot of the visitor centre, holding the paper bag of photographs, looking through the fence at the base he'd called home for the better part of 2 decades. Somewhere beyond those buildings, people were gathering to remember David Moreno. People who had known David, fought beside David, loved David. And Harold, who had carried David over his shoulder through 300 meters of open ground while bullets cracked past his ears, could not get through the gate. He considered leaving. He considered just getting back in his truck and driving home and putting the photographs back in the shoebox and closing the lid and never opening it again. But something held him there, some stubborn fragment of the man he used to be. He leaned against his truck, crossed his arms, and decided to wait. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He just knew he wasn't ready to leave. An hour passed. Harold sat on the bumper of his truck watching the gate. Military vehicles came and went. Soldiers in formation jogged past on the other side of the fence. A convoy of armoured trucks rumbled through the checkpoint. Harold watched all of it with the quiet attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Every vehicle, every uniform, every piece of equipment told a story he could read fluently, even after all these years. The sun climbed higher, and the morning heat began to settle over the parking lot. Harold took off his denim jacket and draped it over the side of the truck bed. Underneath, he wore the pressed button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. The tattoo on the left side of his neck was fully visible now. It was not a large tattoo, about 2 inches tall and 3 inches wide. It depicted a skull wearing a green beret, flanked by crossed arrows, with a series of numbers and letters beneath it that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been part of that particular unit during that particular era. The ink had faded over the decades, blurring at the edges the way old tattoos do, but the image was still unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Harold didn't think about the tattoo. He had gotten it in 1987 after completing a selection process that had a washout rate of over 80%. Every man who passed that selection got the same tattoo in the same place. It was not optional. It was not decorative. It was a mark of belonging, a permanent record of a bond that could not be revoked by expired ID cards or updated security protocols. Harold rubbed his neck absent-mindedly, feeling the slightly raised edges of the old ink under his fingertips, and continued to wait. It was just after 1100 hours when a black SUV with government plates pulled up to the main gate from the base side. The vehicle stopped, and a colonel in dress uniform stepped out. He was tall, mid-50s, with silver at his temples, and the kind of bearing that made everyone within 50 meters stand a little straighter. His name tape read Dawson. Colonel James Dawson, the current base commander of the Special Operations Complex at Fort Bragg. He had come to the gate for a routine matter, a brief with the Provost Marshal about an upcoming dignitary visit that required enhanced security protocols. As he walked toward the gate office, he glanced toward the visitor parking area. He noticed an old man sitting on the bumper of a pickup truck holding a paper bag, staring at the fence. Something about the image caught his attention, but he kept walking. He entered the gate office, conducted his brief, signed 2 documents, and turned to leave. As he stepped back outside, the staff sergeant who had spoken with Harold earlier approached him. "Sir, quick heads up. We've had a retiree at the gate for about 2 hours. Expired ID, claims he's here for a memorial at the SOF chapel. No sponsor, not on the list. He's been cooperative, not causing any trouble, just sitting in the lot. Want us to move him along?" Colonel Dawson looked toward the parking lot again. The old man was still there. "What's his name?" he asked. The staff sergeant checked his notes. "Pickett, sir. Harold Pickett. Says he's a retired command sergeant major." Dawson nodded slowly. The name didn't register immediately. He had served with hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers over his career. But something nagged at him. A feeling more than a memory. "I'll handle it," he said. The staff sergeant looked surprised, but nodded. "Yes, sir." Colonel Dawson walked across the parking lot toward Harold's truck. Harold saw him coming and straightened up, an instinct that 31 years of military service had burned into his muscle memory. He didn't stand at attention, but his posture shifted, his shoulders squared, and his chin lifted slightly. Old habits. Dawson approached with his hands clasped behind his back, the way senior officers do when they are assessing a situation before committing to a course of action. "Morning," Dawson said. "I understand you're trying to get on base for a memorial." Harold nodded. "Yes, sir. For Staff Sergeant David Moreno. We served together. His daughter organised the event." Dawson studied Harold's face. He didn't recognise him. The years had done their work thoroughly, but then Harold turned slightly, adjusting his weight on his bad hip, and the tattoo on his neck caught the full morning sun. Dawson stopped mid-breath. His eyes locked onto the tattoo, the skull, the crossed arrows, the green beret, the alphanumeric designation beneath. The colour drained from Dawson's face in a way that made Harold instinctively check his surroundings, an old combat reflex triggered by seeing another man's fear response. But Dawson wasn't afraid. He was stunned. He stood perfectly still for 3 full seconds, which doesn't sound like a long time until you're standing in a parking lot, watching a colonel process something that doesn't fit into his understanding of the world. Dawson knew that tattoo. He knew it because he had spent the first 3 years of his career hearing stories about the men who wore it. He knew it because that tattoo represented a unit that had been officially dissolved before Dawson even entered the military, a unit whose operations were still classified at the highest levels, whose members were legends spoken about in hushed tones during advanced training courses at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School. He knew it because the unit's history was required reading during his own selection process, and the men who bore that mark were described by his instructors not as soldiers, but as something closer to forces of nature. He knew it because he had only ever seen that specific tattoo on 2 other men in his entire career, and both of those men had buildings named after them on this very base. One of those buildings, Harold knew, but Dawson didn't realise yet, had been dedicated in a ceremony that Harold himself had attended 22 years ago, standing in the back row where nobody would notice him. "Sergeant Major," Dawson said, and his voice changed. The casual assessment was gone. In its place was something Harold hadn't heard directed at him in a very long time: reverence. "That tattoo on your neck, that's Detachment Sierra, Task Force Obsidian." Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly. "Yes, sir. Long time ago." Dawson took a step back. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number and spoke 3 sentences. Then he hung up and looked at Harold with an expression that was equal parts respect and barely contained disbelief. "Sergeant Major Pickett, you're not going through that gate on foot. You're going through it with me." What happened in the next 20 minutes would become the most talked about event at Fort Bragg that month. Colonel Dawson personally drove Harold through the main gate in his own vehicle, but he didn't just drive through, he radioed ahead. Within minutes, the base communication network lit up with a message that passed from the provost marshal to the duty officer to the gate sergeant. By the time the black SUV approached the checkpoint, 2 military police vehicles with lights flashing had positioned themselves as escorts, one in front and one behind. The young gate guards scrambled to raise the barrier. The MPS at the gate, the same ones who had turned Harold away 2 hours earlier, stood at rigid attention as the small convoy passed through. The young specialist who had smirked stopped smirking. His face went pale as he realized the old man he had dismissed was riding in the base commander's personal vehicle with a full security escort, a privilege typically reserved for visiting generals and heads of state. The staff sergeant who had explained the policy stood with his hand locked in a salute that he held until the last vehicle cleared the barrier. His jaw was tight, and a vein in his temple pulsed with something that might have been shame, or might have been awe, or might have been both at the same time. Word spread across the base with the speed that only military gossip can achieve. By the time Dawson's SUV pulled up to the Special Operations Memorial Chapel, a crowd had gathered outside. Not a large crowd, but a significant one. Senior NCOs and officers who had heard the name Harold Pickett from their mentors. Young soldiers who didn't know the name but recognized a full escort when they saw one, and understood that something important was happening. And standing at the chapel entrance, a woman in her 40s with dark hair and red-rimmed eyes, Catherine Moreno, who had been told 5 minutes earlier that the last surviving member of her father's original team had arrived. Harold stepped out of the SUV slowly. His knees protested. His hip sent its familiar signal of pain. But he stood straight. He held the paper bag of photographs against his chest, and when Catherine Moreno walked toward him, Harold Pickett, the man who hadn't cried since 1991, the man who had endured things that would destroy most people without shedding a single tear, felt his eyes fill with water. Catherine stopped in front of him. She didn't speak at first. She just looked at him, this old man her father had told her about during the rare moments when he let himself talk about the past. The man who had carried her father across open ground. The man who had pulled 13 soldiers out of a burning building. The man her father had called the bravest person he had ever known. "You're Harold," she said. It wasn't a question. Harold nodded. "Your dad and I..." His voice broke. He tried again. "Your dad was my brother. Not by blood. Something stronger. He held out the paper bag. I brought these for you. Pictures. From when we were young and stupid and thought we were invincible. Catherine took the bag and pressed it against her chest, mirroring his gesture exactly. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, and Harold stood perfectly still for a moment before his arms came up, and he held on to her like she was the last solid thing in a world that had been shifting beneath his feet for years. Inside the chapel, the memorial was everything David Moreno deserved. The photographs Harold brought became the centerpiece of the display. Images that no one else had. Images from missions that were still technically classified, but which no one in that room was going to report. Young men with dirty faces and bright eyes, standing in front of helicopters and armoured vehicles in landscapes that looked like the surface of another planet. Harold sat in the front row and listened as speakers took the podium one by one. Catherine spoke about growing up with a father who had nightmares he would never explain. David's former commanding officer, now a retired brigadier general, who had driven 4 hours to be there, spoke about the mission that earned David the Silver Star. A chaplain read from scripture, and then Catherine turned to Harold and asked if he wanted to say anything. Harold hadn't prepared remarks. He hadn't expected to speak. He gripped the edges of the pew and pulled himself to his feet. He walked to the podium slowly, adjusted the microphone and looked out at the faces before him. Soldiers, veterans, family members, people who understood. He stood in silence for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "David Moreno was better than me. He was better than all of us. Not because he was the strongest or the fastest or the best shot, although he was all of those things. He was better because he cared about people more than he cared about himself. Every decision he made in combat and out of it was about making sure the man next to him got home. Some of us are still here because of that. I'm still here because of that." Harold paused. He looked at Catherine. "Your father talked about you every single day. Every mission, every patrol, every miserable night in some hole in the ground in the middle of nowhere. He talked about his little girl. You were the reason he kept going. You were the reason all of us kept going, because every man on that team had someone at home who made the fight worth fighting. David made us better soldiers, but more than that, he made us better men, and I have carried him with me every day since the last time I saw him. Not as a burden, as an honour." He stepped away from the podium and returned to his seat. The chapel was silent except for the sound of people trying very hard not to make a sound. After the memorial, Colonel Dawson pulled Harold aside. They stood in the hallway of the chapel away from the crowd. Dawson spoke quietly but with unmistakable intensity. He told Harold that he had made some calls while Harold was inside. He had spoken with the garrison commander, the installation access office, and the veterans liaison. He told Harold that a new permanent access pass would be issued to him within 48 hours, with full base privileges restored. He told Harold that the incident at the gate would be reviewed, not as a disciplinary matter against the MPs, who had technically followed correct procedure, but as a case study in how the system sometimes fails the very people it exists to serve. He told Harold that he was personally inviting him to speak at the next Special Operations Heritage event, scheduled for the following month. Harold listened to all of this without expression. Then he said, "Colonel, I appreciate it, but those young soldiers at the gate were doing their job. I don't want anyone getting in trouble because an old man showed up without the right paperwork." Dawson shook his head. "Sergeant Major, you are the right paperwork. Men like you are the reason this base exists. The system should work for you, not against you, and I intend to make sure it does." They shook hands. Not the quick, formal handshake of military protocol, but the kind of handshake that lasts a few seconds longer than necessary, where both men grip hard enough to say things that words can't. Dawson held the door as Harold walked back out into the sunlight. Harold drove home that afternoon with an empty paper bag on the passenger seat, and a feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite name. It was something between grief and gratitude, the particular ache that comes from being reminded that you once belonged to something extraordinary, and that the proof of it still lives in the world, even after you've convinced yourself that it doesn't. He pulled into his driveway, got out of the truck, and noticed that the stray cat was sitting on the porch railing waiting for him. He went inside, fed the cat, made a cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. The shoebox was still there, open, with a few photographs remaining at the bottom. Harold looked at them for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the VFW. He told the woman who answered that he wanted to come back to the Thursday meetings. She said they'd be glad to have him. He hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen, drinking his coffee, feeling the warmth of the cup against his arthritic hands. Outside, the birds were fighting over the feeder again. 3 weeks later, Harold stood at the podium of the Special Operations Heritage event in front of 400 soldiers, veterans and dignitaries. He wore a suit for the first time in years. Catherine Moreno sat in the front row. Colonel Dawson sat beside her. Harold told stories that had never been told outside of classified briefing rooms. He spoke about David Moreno, about the men of Detachment Sierra, about missions in places that still don't appear on any public record. He spoke about sacrifice and silence and the peculiar loneliness of carrying secrets that define your entire life, but that you can never share. He spoke about what it means to come home from war and discover that the country you fought for has moved on without you, that the grocery store clerk and the mailman and the neighbour with the barking dog have no idea what you did or what it cost you, and that this is both the blessing and the curse of service. He spoke about growing old and invisible, and how easy it is to forget that you matter when the world forgets first. He spoke about Linda, briefly, and how she never asked him to explain the nightmares, because she understood that some things live in a place that language cannot reach. He spoke about the stray cat on his porch and how sometimes the smallest acts of showing up, of just being present, are the most important things a person can do. And when he finished, 400 people rose to their feet. The ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Harold stood at the podium with his hands at his sides and his chin up and his eyes dry, because some habits you never lose, no matter how many years go by. That evening, the young MP who had first turned Harold away at the gate found Harold in the parking lot after the event. He was a private first class named Torres. He stood in front of Harold looking like a man who had spent 3 weeks carrying something heavy. "Sergeant Major," Torres said, "I want to apologize for how I treated you at the gate. I didn't know who you were." Harold looked at him steadily. Then he put his hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "Son, you didn't treat me badly. You did your job. But I'll tell you something that took me about 50 years to learn. Every person who walks up to that gate has a story you don't know. You can follow every rule in the book and still miss the most important thing standing right in front of you. The rules tell you what to do. Your gut tells you who you're dealing with. Learn to listen to both." Torres nodded. He stood a little straighter, and for a brief moment, Harold saw something in the young soldier's eyes that reminded him of another young man, decades ago, standing in a desert with dust on his face and a whole life ahead of him. Harold squeezed Torres's shoulder once, then let go and walked to his truck. He drove home under a sky full of stars, the windows down, the warm North Carolina air filling the cab. The stray cat was on the porch when he arrived. Harold sat down beside it, leaned back in the old wooden chair and looked up at the sky. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. If this story moved you, if you believe that the men and women who served deserve to be seen and remembered no matter how much time has passed or how much the world has changed, then subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories that don't make the headlines, but that deserve to be heard. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and if you know a veteran in your life, reach out to them. You might be surprised by the story they've never told you.